So welcome everybody. Welcome everybody. So good to be with you and to be with people from all over the world. We are crossing continents here together. So I would like to tell you about us a little bit. Our beloved Jack, Dr. Jack Saul, PhD, is the founding director of the International Trauma Studies Program, ITSP, a research and training institute based in New York City. ITSP is committed to enhancing the natural resilience and coping capacities in individuals, families, and communities that have endured and or are threatened by traumatic events. He has served on the faculties of New York University School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry, the New School for Social Research, Clinical Psychology Program, and Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. As a psychologist and family therapist, he has created a number of programs both in New York City and abroad for populations that have endured disaster, war, torture, and political violence. His book, Collective Trauma, Collective Healing, documenting his experiences, was published by Routledge in 2013, and is really what takes us here. For those who don't know me, I am Marcelo Bronstein. I'm a rabbi, a psychologist. I am a mindfulness facilitator. I've been a rabbi for 24 years in Congregation B'nai Jeshurun in Manhattan, and also always working as a psychologist. And now I live with my wife Karina in a 21st century international eco-village in the Costa Rican mountains, where I see clients online, and we organize Jewish mindfulness retreats in nature. And Jack and I, Jack, Esther, Karina, and I are dear friends. And we were having a powerful conversation about this not so long ago, and we said, why not to share this conversation? So, Jack, why don't we go straight to the chase? What is trauma? How do we define trauma? And how do we define collective trauma?
Thank you, Marcelo. I'm glad to be at the inaugural event of your webinar series. And I look forward to a really interesting discussion. First of all, trauma, we tend to think of trauma mostly as an individual response to overwhelming events. And, but traumas overwhelm systems. And whether they're individual, families, communities, organizations, or even nations. And when we think about a collective trauma, we're thinking about a large-scale trauma that's shared by an entire population. But what's characteristic of collective traumas is that they can be a blow to the basic tissues of social life and destroy the bonds that connect people. And in this current pandemic, we've seen that because of the efforts that we need to make in order to protect ourselves, there is a large-scale disruption of our social relationships. It's part of the response here. So it's considered a collective trauma.
Mm-hmm. And this social distancing, which seems to be, besides washing our hands constantly, but social distancing seems to be the only way that we have to deal, at least that we know, with COVID-19, to flatten the curve. In which way social distancing you see is contributing to this collective drama?
Well, it does. It forces us to be able to connect in other ways. We're fortunate that we have social media for those of us who have it. In many parts of the world, there are no ways of connecting online. So it's a very serious problem. And it's and for many people around the world, it's very difficult and impossible even to engage in social distancing because they live in very compacted, settings. People are very close with each other and they need to be able to have contact in order to get basic needs met. But this is an unusual trauma in that in order to protect ourselves, we do need to disconnect physically. But as we've seen, much of the way that we're adapting to this is by connecting socially through other ways. So people have been developing very innovative ways of staying connected with the people in their lives, but it still takes its toll because even our closest relationships, we often are not physically in contact with. And this is not to mention the thousands of kind of soft relationships that we usually have just by being in physical proximity to people, the people at the store we go to get our food from, or our barber, or the people we pass in our everyday lives. These are also relationships that we are disconnected from. We often don't. We're not as aware of those sometimes, but it has an impact on us as well, and can be a part of the process of grieving the many losses that we're experiencing during this time.
Mm-hmm. Do you see a relationship between the stress that we are experiencing, and the other day when we were talking, we talked about collective immunity. Is there some connection there?
Well, when we look at the most important way of approaching a collective trauma is by strengthening our collective resilience, meaning our capacity to cope with adversity by coming together and pooling our resources to be able to support each other, to share information, to problem solve. This is actually the most important capacity in order to prevent mental health problems in the future, post-traumatic stress. So in a collective trauma like this, we need to be able to come together, and which is made more difficult by the fact that we are having to practice social distancing. But the real thing that we usually feel is a threat to our collective resilience is the inevitable tendency to fragment in a traumatic situation like this. There's a tendency for people to get tired, frustrated with other people, to turn their aggression on to the people close to them. And you'll see this kind of fragmentation and social division as an inevitable consequence of collective trauma. So this kind of social division and lack of unity actually is what makes us more vulnerable to trauma, but also makes us more vulnerable to a virus, because stress and a lack of resilience actually makes us it compromises our immune system on an individual and a collective level. And as everyone knows, in order to best fight this pandemic, we need to be able to develop our collective immunity. But if we're in conflict, that makes the challenge of dealing with that collective, having that collective immunity much more difficult. And
is there such a thing as collective immunity, Jack?
Well, that's what we refer to as herd immunity. You know, when a certain percentage of the population is able to resist the illness, then the virus can't really take, you know, it subsides. And that's what we're shooting for now, by the social distancing, by the many practices that we're engaged in, and also developing, doing the testing in order to be able to quickly respond to any hotspots that develop, but also ultimately to have a vaccine so that we can have at least a major part of the population, I think it's over 60%, having some kind of immunity to the virus. And then the virus will eventually gradually dissipate. So that would be our collective immunity. But our collective immunity is a consequence of our collective well-being.
Yeah.
And that's the point I'm trying to make from a mental health perspective.
Yeah.
So when we have division in a society, like we do here, I think it makes us much more vulnerable to the virus.
Yes.
So, and we've seen that there are societies that are able to come together and put down their social differences and to have a united approach to the virus. I think two countries that stand out are Norway and New Zealand. And these are countries that have responded to previous collective traumas, previous national traumas, like mass shootings, in a very unified way. And they really are exemplary in the way that they dealt with, you know, created rituals that condemned the hatred and extremism that led to those mass shootings, and then supported the victims. The whole country rallied together to support the victims of those tragedies. So they have a track record of unification in the face of collective trauma, and that they've actually done quite well now in dealing with the pandemic. And I think we're going to see the countries that are less able to come together really have much more difficulty in dealing with the pandemic as well.
In many ways, the fragility of the strength of a society were there before COVID-19. And what COVID-19 does is putting a magnifying glass on the underlying tension and fragmentation of a society, all the more so if you have a leadership that foster that division and that fragmentation. And that's the issue that I wanted to touch also, which is the issue of moral injury. In which way moral injury is something that collaborates with this new immunity, social immunity, or lack of social immunity. Also, if you could define what this injury, moral injury, is all about.
So I've been working on this issue of moral injury in the past few years, having been a therapist for many war correspondents who were covering the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then I started working with veterans who are also covering those wars. And there's an experience that many of them have as a result of either participating or witnessing events in those wars that violated their sense of moral rightness, you know, and it leads to, especially in the veterans, what we call moral injury, which is a sense of shame and guilt that can really be quite distressing. And it may be what contributes to the high level of suicides among veterans, which is these days, and more recently has been about 20 per day. Wow. And it's not post-traumatic stress disorder that leads to the suicides. It's problems of conscience and moral injury. And so this distress in which one is struggling to, has been kind of morally dislocated, feels like one's identity has been undermined because one's sense of right and wrong has been so disrupted. It becomes very distressing. And it's also associated with having one's leaders make decisions that one finds morally reprehensible. So what I'm seeing in my clinical practice and what I think many clinicians are seeing these days is a concern about some of the decisions that are being made that seem to be kind of not morally grounded, and decisions that actually would lead to the most effective way of dealing with the epidemic. So it leads many of us to think that in order to best, one of the things that we need to do in order to address this collective trauma is to engage in some kind of process of collective moral repair. We've seen that the veterans who are best able to recover and to reduce some of their guilt and shame about what they've been through, they come together and they engage in what's called truth telling. And they engage in communal healing rituals that bring them together with civilians who can share in the responsibility that they exhibited in going to war. The public is implicated. So the process of collective moral repair is one in which usually starts with engaging in some process of recovering our basic moral values that we all agree on, and which undermine or underlie, I think, our communality, as a people. And I've learned a great deal from some of my colleagues at the Philadelphia VA who have been developing these kind of communal healing rituals to deal with moral injury. And I think it's a model also for what we need to be able to be doing in our society in general. So I want to come back to it, but I want to invite people into that kind of rich, idea to invite ideas about how to promote a process of collective moral repair and a positive moral vision. But we'll come back to that.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. And our dear friend Sarah Nasser Sadeh from California, she's asking, what are the collective rituals we can create in the context of physical distancing that you can recommend to share truth and stories? But Sarah will come back to that in a moment, because I want to, first of all, it's great that you're participating by sending us questions. Of course, we have a structure. We had this conversation a few times, and we know what we want to say. But it's wonderful that that you ask us questions. And there is a question here. I lost the. Oops. Okay, chat. There's a question that somebody asked. Do you think the amount of time families are spending together, if they contribute to the problem or to the solution? Let's put it that way, because I just lost the question. Here it is. From Maya Michelson. Do you think the amount of time families are spending together is contributing to trauma, or there is another dynamic that is happening? And we were talking, many people are saying the number of kids or babies that are going to be born out of this, and the number of divorces that are going to happen also because of this moment. So it's a good question. Can we tackle a little bit into that and to intersperse the question of our participants? We have Sarah for later and Maya about the amount of time that families are spending together, if it's contributing to the trauma.
Do you want to answer that, Marcelo?
As a psychologist, as a rabbi, we talk a lot about this in our groups, and I'm doing also in this moment groups working with a specific technique when people can talk and we do a circle of clarifying questions. I think like everything in life, it depends on the landscape where this is happening. If we are in a family where abuse is happening, this is going to exacerbate. And this is a family where there is conversation, there's the possibility of talking, there is a completely different landscape. The problem is that we cannot take for granted in this moment, where are we showing up from as families? I have a lot of compassion in this moment for family with young kids. And when they are run out of games and they run out of patience and they run out of everything, and this frustration takes place. I was talking to a family recently when they are in this moment rotating the responsibilities in the house. You know, okay, you are in charge today, and then you are in charge today. And so the parents not being the police and to share the responsibility with the kids. I was talking to a father who is very, very scared because this teenage girl is acting out. This teenage girl is facing grief because she's losing her graduation, and anxiety for the future because she's not going to be able to start college. And she doesn't have the mechanisms to deal with this. So she's acting out. And the father, who is the one who contacted me, is asking the question, how much should I open the doors? Because I see that my girl cannot take it anymore. So we talk about creating groups for the teams, Zoom groups for the teams. Also, what's the right amount of Zooming that we're having? Does Zoom, that help us to be together, adds to the trauma or not? How much Zoom are we allowing our young kids to be in front of the screens? So we are in this gray zone of something that is completely unprecedented, and we have to play by ear. But the truth of the matter is that, this is where mindfulness for me plays in. We have to be very aware, where is it that we are operating from? Where is our trauma? Where is our anxiety? Where is our hope? And to try to operate with a higher self. We cannot do it all the time, but we were talking yesterday that we contribute to the trauma or we contribute to the healing. And depending where we operate from, we contribute to one or the other. And sometimes we cannot avoid maybe to contribute to the trauma, to be so much time on Zoom. Isn't this driving us crazy? How many hours do we spend in the computer?
We don't know what the effect is going to be on people.
Yeah.
Being just connected by screen.
Yeah.
We need to watch that closely, what the effects may be in the future. But in terms of families, I mean, the question that I think Maya was asking, I mean, we're seeing in the clinical work that families can go either way. This can be a time that actually exacerbates difficulties in the family, or it can be a special time for families to be together and to find ways of connecting in ways that they haven't had a chance to, because they haven't had this kind of time, opportunity to have this kind of time together. So it's hard to predict which way a family can go, but they go in both directions during this time. I see a very interesting question here from Frederica Bubenzer from South Africa, who is asking, who's saying that COVID-19 collective trauma has landed on 350 odd years of unaddressed trauma related to colonialism, apartheid. How do you sequence these different layers? Whoa, that's quite a question. And it goes back to what we were talking about before. We're collective traumas exacerbate the previous fault lines in a society. And those fault lines are often caused by racial, social, and economic inequality, and can be part of the vulnerabilities that have led to a collective, a country not dealing as well as it might have with a situation like this. But certainly the fault lines are due to, unaddressed historical trauma, over hundreds of years. And, we are at a time in our society as well, in the US, where we are having some of these historical traumas becoming much more clear, and people really trying to address them and not keep kind of pushing them underground. But I think that there are a lot of hopeful signs that we are moving in the direction as a society to acknowledge these historical traumas and the kind of disconnections that they create in the society. But how do you, that's an interesting question about which ones to look at first. Because in many societies you have quite a few layers of collective trauma, and often collective trauma that's unaddressed.
You're talking specifically regarding the States about the story of racism and slavery?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And how that
I think that's probably the most relevant one in our society, because it actually has a direct impact as well on who's most vulnerable. We know now that African Americans in the US are much more physically vulnerable to the virus, probably due to, poor health care and economic circumstances and place where they live in cities. So some of the people who are most vulnerable due to these structural issues are suffering the most from the pandemic.
Let me ask you, we were also talking the other day, of just remembering part of the conversation on your experience regarding the Holocaust. So we have the experience of Germany as a society that produced this type of evil and sinking into this type of fascism and brutality, and the case of the Jewish people, in the case of being the victims, one of the main victims of the Holocaust. How's this, or your experience in dealing with collective trauma and specifically bringing back the subject of resilience, apply there according to your experience?
So I started working on the issue of families of the Holocaust survivors like 40 years ago, and was I had the fortunate opportunity to work with a psychiatrist from Israel who was a survivor himself and was a psychoanalyst and had been working with families in different contexts. And he's someone who really articulated back then the importance of collective resilience in dealing with trauma. And so one of the things that he taught me was that for many of the families that we're dealing with, many of these Jewish families that we're dealing with having survived the Holocaust, the support provided by the community and the culture were crucial to their successful adaptation. Most survivors did not go for therapy or professional help, but they instead engaged in an array of communal activities where they came together, they supported each other, they had these peer discussion groups, often informal groups, and they engaged in an array of kind of ways of memorializing the people who had died, who didn't survive. They had gatherings of survivors from the same towns. They created testimonial archives to document what had happened. They planted thousands of trees as symbols of rebirth and life. They got married and had their own children as a kind of symbol of an affirmation of life after having gone through such a, horrible dark period. And I think that this way of forming new families was a way of countering the disruption that they had experienced in their lives and finding a remedy for the dehumanization and loneliness that they felt during the war. But they also relied on their culture, religion, and identity as key factors in their adaptation during the war and in rebuilding their lives afterwards. They found sources in their culture to give them a sense of continuity and an affirmation of their basic cultural and moral values, which was key to, their being able to come together, support each other, and to deal with their traumatic past.
And what about Germany, Jack? What about Germany as a country, as the perpetrator in those days?
Well, the relationship with the perpetrator also is very important, because in contexts where the survivors of massive trauma don't not have the perpetrating culture does not acknowledge what happened. It can be felt as extremely distressing, and that's been the case of for Armenians who have been seeking some acknowledgement for the genocide by the Turkish government for over 100 years. And so they've had to go along a different path in order to engage in a process of recovery. But in the context of Nazi Germany, they were engaging in a process of addressing the collective trauma in their own way. It was something that was felt as traumatic in the society for Germans as well. Not to minimize the Jewish experience, but it was something that was regretted. And I think one of the most amazing historical kind of kind of museums that I've ever visited is the museum called the Topography of Terror, which documents the way in which Germany evolved into a fascist state, step by step. And, this is part of the legacy that they have created there in Germany, to remember and to try to make sure that this kind of thing does not happen in the future.
Yeah. In many ways, you're saying that part of the healing in the case of America would be to see what happens with slavery, what happened with the indigenous population of America.
Well, I think one of the really interesting signs these days is the Museum of Lynching in Montgomery, Absolutely. Alabama. This is one of the first major acknowledgments of this kind of violent racism that has taken place in our country, most of which has been covered over and really not a part of our collective narrative. And it's gradually entering into it. And we still have a ways to go.
Yeah. We were talking also, I would like to bring it back to our attention, the importance of rituals here. You know, in the Jewish tradition, we have created rituals. Rituals in general, what they do, they organize life, and they give meaning and they give purpose. One of the major rituals that we have is the Passover Seder. So we were slaves in Egypt, and we have a dinner where we have to relive the story of slavery, and we have to get out to go to this promised land, to go to this promise, to this place, to optimism, to the future. So this is a ritualization of the pain. And it's interesting because one of the most important commandments of the Passover Seder is that everybody has to see himself and herself as if he or she was in Egypt, meaning, not when I'm talking about the actual Egypt, in the place of slavery. So you have to the tradition is saying you have to go to your collective unconscious and see yourself there. You have to put yourself in the shoes of something that is impossible for you actually to remember. So you have to remember, become a member again by remembering and by having this ritual that actually then sends you to the future. And in many ways we have done that with many holidays that have stories of persecution. You know, we have ritualized, instead of forgetting these issues, we have ritualized them and creating a holiday where we remember something and then we move to the future. In many ways, I think that's at the center of the resilience of the Jewish people. I remember in one of this famous trip that these rabbis made to Dharamsala to meet with the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama was very interested in this ritual of Passover, telling the story of exile, as he was thinking how I'm going to tell the story of exile when I'm out of Tibet. How do I remember of the roots where we come from as a way to tell the people where we are going towards? So I'm bringing this issue of rituals. How these rituals do you think play? I know that you have experience with this after 9/11. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Marcelo, so we're now in the wilderness.
Yes, absolutely.
And we are in that place in between where we just left, that world that we knew before, which has changed so radically. And we don't know where we're going yet. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. We don't know what the future is going to look like. And in the process of going through these phases of collective trauma, we're in this state now, in between, this liminal phase, where we need to be putting into place the steps toward the future. We need to be able to not only put together rituals that grieve our losses that we're dealing with, but we're also needing to engage in rituals that envision the type of future that we hope that we can move toward. If we don't begin now to envision or create a positive vision for our recovery, there is a tendency to drift into the visions of those who would take advantage of this situation and promote their own agendas. Disasters are always situations in which people are vulnerable to being exploited because people are defenseless. And so you often see people who have agendas taking it, say, okay, now we have an opportunity to push through something that we were not able to push through before. And we, in order to counter that, we need to develop a positive vision about where we would like to go. And I think that that's the creative kind of innovative moment for us right now, that we really we need to invent rituals.
What you said is that we are in this liminal space. It's too early to envision, but we have to put the seeds of that.
It's not too early to start to envision.
Okay.
I think that we saw this after 9/11 in New York City. I think one of the most useful interventions was called Envision New York City. It was a collaborative effort by many different occupations, including artists in New York, to envision what New York could be as it returned to recovery, as it recovered from the terrorist events, how it could be returned to becoming a vital city. And I think this positive vision of recovery gives people some hope. Of course, it's not, it has to incorporate the changing realities that we are going to be dealing with. I mean, we can't just develop a clear vision because it's always in motion, but we can start to put together, as you say, the seeds of what that positive vision is going to look like. So I think that the time is now for us to be having the kind of conversations that are envisioning conversations and creating rituals now in different parts of society that where people can come together and give their voice, because that collective vision of recovery really needs to capitalize on the diversity of voices in our society in order to be most effective, in order to heal the divisions that we have. It needs to be an inclusive voice. Narratives after trauma that leave people out, that marginalize people's experience, end up traumatizing them further because they feel like their experience is not really validated in the collective narrative that's forming. And that collective narrative is a major part of this process of envisioning. It's the story that we're telling about what we're going through, and it's the story that we're telling about where we want to go to. So that's one of the things that I focused on in my work with collective trauma, is how to mobilize communities to engage in a process of collective narration about what we're going through and to concretize it in some way. We've done it through the arts, through theater, through different archives, online narrative archives. There's tremendous possibility for how to promote that kind of collective conversation.
Yeah, regarding that, there is a wonderful question that says, how about relinking the older and the younger generations, as they are so differently affected by the virus? What rituals we need for that? Because I was thinking exactly what you were saying, how this could be expressed in a family. It's about a family journaling together. It's about a family writing a story together. It's about, I remember a few years ago when you mentioned, I was touched in so many ways by the abuses of power and fascism in Latin America, and Argentina and Chile. And I remember when you told me that you were working with the survivors of torture, and the role that theater play for them, that they couldn't talk about the trauma, but they were able to act it out without saying that they were acting what they were producing. So I'm thinking this question, so in which way it maybe could be through theater, through creating family plays, because the family together is being asked to be in this container that is completely outside of time and space. is like entering into this capsule of meaninglessness and confusion and not knowing, anxiety about the future, and grief about the past, and entering this in this bubble of different level of consciousness. So I'm thinking if theater is writing,
I think you have this. This
could
is a
be, what
really
could
good
be,
idea,
yeah,
Marcelo. The idea of families creating the narratives, contributing to a larger collective narrative by pulling together the views from different family members. It's like this is our family's contribution to this. And it's really important. I like Joop's question about linking the older and the younger, because they bring different resources in dealing with trauma. Older people often have lived through many traumas in their lives, collective traumas. You know, older people who in the world these days have probably lived through quite a few, and they have the memory of what was important in dealing with these traumas of the past. They have the wisdom of what can work. Younger people, including children, young children, bring a kind of freshness and spontaneity and incredible perceptiveness to what's going on that we can often miss.
yeah,
So it's definitely important. I mean, when we think about resilience, we think about tapping into the diversity of voices, including the diversity of voices of generations. So so that includes the young and the old. But
yeah,
you know, as a generational issue, the young these days, the teenagers and young adults who are entering the world right now are, I think, a special case, also vulnerable population, because they're entering a world where they have been asked to make a lot of sacrifice,
yeah, yeah.
and it's a world that usually doesn't give them much in return.
Yeah. Regarding that, I have two things. One is that, my wife Karina, she works with intergenerational population, and she's making dialogues with children, actually, about how they live COVID-19, and it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating to see what they say and how they react to that and how they connect with this vulnerability. But I want to go to something very personal, if you don't mind, and it's personal to you and personal to me. We are in the vulnerable category. We are more or less the same age. And how does it feel for you that we are put in this category of being more in danger, being more vulnerable?
Well, first of all, I have to acknowledge my privilege of being someone who could go somewhere and feel out of the city,
Yes.
and it's not a small thing when you have so many people who don't have that kind of mobility. So I feel fortunate for my privilege, and I think it makes me feel more committed to the work that I'm doing during the pandemic to address the needs of people who are not so fortunate. But as an older, more vulnerable person, I'm much more aware of my, I think, potential mortality than I have been before, and probably more than people who are younger. And so it's definitely a factor in what kind of decisions I'm making these days about where I want to be putting my energies and taking extra care to protect myself from getting the illness.
So taking care of ourselves and understanding, those of us who have privilege, that we have it. And at the same time, it's a huge opportunity to reprioritize. What is it that is in the front? What is it that is in the back burner? And to see that here there is, in this upside down, maybe there is a possibility of rethink about the future. And this comes back to what you're saying about the envisioning. You know, Otto Scharmer, in his book Theory U, he talks about, and you know, we go to the bottom of the U when we look at the essence of things after downloading from our experience. We enter into a process of co-creation. And you're saying we're not there yet. We are in the wilderness. And he uses a word that is very interesting, that is connected to this envisioning, that is prototyping. That maybe we are not going to find clear rituals and clear solutions, but maybe we could begin to prototype. You know, in the envisioning, kids are going to go back to school. So it's not normal. Going back to school, it's not going to be normal. So what are the rituals? What are the prototyping to go back to school? You know, what is the new prototyping of taking care of the elderly? So like, you know, so what I'm saying, like dress rehearsals of.
Well, this is an opportunity to rethink and redesign.
Yeah.
A lot of different things: education, healthcare system. You know, it's not that resilience is not about returning to the way things were. Resilience is also about moving forward to a new future that's much more what we would like, and it's much more, you know, is different and solves the problems that were there previously. I see a couple of questions that I think are interesting. Keith is asking about what are the things that may be counterintuitive for lay people about the issue of collective trauma, in understanding collective trauma. I think one of the things that maybe is counterintuitive is that what we've been trying to say here about this pandemic is that it's much broader. I mean, we're focusing on not just the pandemic, but on the impact that this pandemic is having on our social ecology. And in fact, the way you, from a systems perspective, deal with a collective trauma is that you have to strengthen the social ecology. It's not just about fighting the illness. You need to strengthen the body, and so they can have a stronger immune system. So I think what may be counterintuitive to a lot of people is bringing in this issue of, it's not just the virus we're dealing with the social disruption.
Yes. And
the need to repair that, the social and moral disruption. And those need attention as much as the fighting the virus do.
One of the things that is beautiful about the metaphor of the promised land, that there is a promise. You know, there is the aspirational. And when the aspirational is thrown out of our leadership, or thrown out of our lives, we don't see a true north. And that creates a tremendous sense of dislocation. And so optimism and resilience is about recovering the moral compass and recovering the optimism and recovering the possibility to look that there is a promise. And the promise has to do with justice, with compassion, with loving kindness, understanding that you know, there's something that this pandemic is saying to us, that the walls and borders don't matter too much to the pandemic, and we need to heal the world here. If not, nobody is going to be saved. So it's a huge reminder in many ways of our connectivity.
So we just have a couple of minutes left.
Yes.
And we spoke about inviting all
Yes.
of you and the people who will watch this on recording later to engage with us in this conversation about what do we need to be thinking of to envision, to create a positive moral vision, create a positive vision of our recovery.
And possible rituals.
What rituals would be useful to create? I'm trying to, I want to send my, on the chat, my email, everyone, that you can send me messages. We're going, if you want to be a part of this conversation, please send me your email address and we'll invite you to the next conversation. I plan to have a series of conversations about this topic to continue this. So you can either send it on the chat now. Tell us if you'd like to be a part of that conversation. Or I'm going to also, well, that's probably the best thing to do. Put it on the chat. We'll have a few minutes for you to do that.
But you have to put your email.
Well, I don't need to now because people are sending their email.
Collect the emails.
So that's good. We're seeing it here.
Wonderful.
Is there anything else you want to say, Marcelo? Thank you for inviting me again to have this conversation.
Yes. Also, I am, as I said, living this also very privileged in this eco village in the mountains of Costa Rica, where we observe social distancing, but we are people who decided to live a different type of life. And from the mindfulness and spiritual perspective, I believe that rituals are crucial. And we need rituals that unite us, rituals that bring the best of us, and rituals to help us to lead with trauma. So thank you, Jack. Love you, my friend. And we're going to continue, God willing, with other conversations. So I say to everybody else to be continued. Jack is going to tell you about other conversations. I'm going to tell you. And thank you, and good afternoon, good night, good morning, depending where is it that you are in the globe in this moment. Thank you for your trust and your desire to be part of this conversation.
Thank you very much for joining us.